Our next speaker is going to be talking about the future of the domestic gas industry through the transition to a low-carbon energy system. He's going to be Frank Tudor, who's the Chief Executive Officer and Managing Director of Gemini. Frank.
What should I be doing?
The last person pointed at the screen.
The screen? This one here. No. Try again? Oh, there we are. Great. Thank you. Okay. Thanks, everyone. Firstly, I would like to pay my respects to the Gadigal people of the Aurora Nation, acknowledge their elders and all of their leaders, and in particular pay respect to the connection and the custodianship of this land that they've had for many, many thousands of years. For those of you that don't know a little about our company, we're basically Gemina and Zimfra, that may be the names that are familiar to you, and we own, operate and service both gas and electricity infrastructure across the country. I am going to talk, as was suggested, about the future of gas, particularly in the energy transformation. But I just wanted to make one point of reflection. If anything came out of COP26, I think it was a clear pivot that we've moved beyond the if and the when to really the how do we get there. How do we get there? How do we deal with net zero by 2050 as quickly as we possibly can, while solving the energy trilemma, which is reliability, affordability and sustainability. As I put it in my own words, it's less about Greta Thunberg, it's more about Alan Finkel. And I would recommend Alan's quarterly essay on getting to zero. It is quite a good read. So the other thing I would reflect on is we've got reliability, affordability and sustainability. And if you think about the trilemma, it is really about making trade-offs between all of those. But I'd suggest to you that we've committed to sustainability, net zero by 2050, interim targets. And, you know, reliability and affordability are certainly things that we can trade off, but perhaps sustainability should be thought about as a given. And I'll come back to that. So I was going to talk about probably things that are very familiar to the audience here, but where we start from in terms of our primary energy consumption. And one of the things that we've been blessed with, you can see that we've got diversity, you know, across oil, across gas, across coal, perhaps less so in oil in recent times, but certainly when it comes to coal and gas, we've got it in abundance, enough for our domestic needs, and indeed we're, you know, significant exporters of both of those commodities. What underpins that is diversity, which underpins reliability. And for us, so few people with such an abundance, security hasn't been a particular issue until perhaps recent times. And it's important to understand that this is a source and has been historically a source of comparative advantage for us. We've had access to low energy cost that's underpinned manufacturing, underpinned the growth of the economy, indeed our standard of living. So important to kind of reflect on that as we think about the transformation that we've already embarked on. If you then look at the final energy consumption, and what we've got there is the spread across oil, gas, electricity, and equally we've got electricity broken down, and you can see the heavy dependence that we currently have on coal, which last year I think was 63%. So coal last year produced 63% of electricity in this country. So as we think about the transformation that we're about to embark on, renewable energy is the cheapest form of energy. So if you can imagine starting with that first bar on the right-hand column, we can see the yellow getting bigger and bigger as we electrify the economy. And then within the yellow, we're going to be focusing much more on the green. And as you think about that, I'll give you sort of 3 points of reflection. One is, if you were to go above the NEM kind of in a drone and imagine that it is a pattern What we need to achieve as we go through the transformation is almost a fractal balance, so that in each and every part of the grid, we've got the requisite amount of firming and non-firming technology to give us the reliability that we need. And that needs to be achieved at every point in the process. Where it's not, we have issues as we did have in 2016 with South Australia. So that's pretty critical. I think the other thing to think about the transformation that we're about to embark on is think about it from the customer's point of view. And we've done very little of this because we're just turning our mind to the how. But if you think about it from a customer's point of view, somebody on a street who's been told that they're going to be moving from gas to electricity, so what they see is the removal of choice. What they potentially see is an imposition of cost, because within a certain time frame you need to buy the appliances, you need to electrify, get ready to take electricity. At a street level, we've started to turn our mind to what does it mean at the distribution level in terms of the cost. It is really pretty staggering. In the case of the ACT, where we have done some studies, it's a 3- to 4-fold increase in terms of a RAB, regulated asset base, going from $1 billion to $3 to $4 billion in the time frame that they're talking about. Imagine at the street level what that means in terms of the projects that need to be put in place. And alongside that, you're actually removing, potentially abandoning, the gas distribution system. So when you think about it from a customer point of view, you can see that unless that is synchronised with discipline, there is a real risk that we have chaos. And that is something that we must either enforce or we must potentially avoid. And there may be ways of being able to do that. And the final piece that I'd have you reflect on, which goes to this issue of doability that I'd like to introduce into the room, if you think about the enormity of the task that's in front of us, the energy system that we have and we enjoy the benefits of today has taken us 200 odd years to build. We're going to replace that and probably double, quadruple the size of it in the next 30 years. We did a piece of work with Energy Networks Australia probably about 3 to 4 years ago with CSIRO that suggested $1 trillion following a particular pathway needed to be invested through to 2050 to replace and continue to maintain the energy infrastructure that we've got. That's a pretty significant number. If you do read Alan's book, Quarterly Essay, he starts, there's a chapter at the very beginning which is mountain to scale. And the words that he uses, the challenges of switching the world to clean energy are almost beyond comprehension. So the issue that we face is that, we're going to be doing this. Every other state and territory in the country is going to be doing this. Every other country is potentially going to be on the same pathway. And if you can imagine the draw on resources, the critical bottlenecks that we're going to get in the supply chains for renewable energy, we need to be cognizant of these before we sort of make reckless choices up front and cut off options up front. So there are some really significant issues associated with the doability. So from our company's point of view, I think the way that we think about the energy trilemma is, for those of us that work in the industry, we know that safety is paramount. We know that security in this environment globally is absolutely non-negotiable, and sustainability by definition, net zero by 2050, is a given. So in fact, the things that we've got to trade off are reliability, affordability, and doability. What is the pathway that we're going to be following? How do we get there? And what is the most pragmatic engineering, sound engineering way of actually getting to where we need to get to? Gas story will be very familiar to all of you, so I won't dwell on it, but gas has been around for a long period of time. We have infrastructure in Sydney going back to 1836, where we had town gas, predominantly hydrogen, as it turns out, Rob. From that time we had gas that developed as a byproduct of oil. Gas in its own right became very valuable. And if you go to the middle column there, we've got basically a very significant part of the Australian economy which is in and around the gas industry. 250 billion per annum. I tried to get a number of how many jobs directly and indirectly are employed in the gas industry, and it's probably around 260,000 but there may be a little bit of a stretch, but there's a significant proportion of our economy that's tied up with gas. There's a significant capability that we've developed over 200 years in the gas industry. And then the future of gas, and perhaps I'll start that by saying, we see gas, probably as Rob has indicated, as a transition fuel. It supports the take-up of renewable energy. It's critical in that firming role. But then, as we think about gas in the medium to longer term, we see it transitioning in its own right. We have renewable gases which capture, biogas, potentially providing a bridge into hydrogen. And alongside that, you have natural gas with carbon capture and storage, which probably cover the full suite of clean gases, if you like. To label a couple of points, I think we are very, because we do have in our businesses direct connections to a whole lot of residential customers in Sydney and Victoria and the ACT. We do have customer councils. We do poll the customer councils to see what's important to them. And it wouldn't surprise you that they've come back from their perspective with affordability as being the most important, reliability, and then sustainability. And if you think about those three dimensions and the way gas can contribute, you take the first one, reliability. The thing I'd say about gas is we've got this enormous capability. Gas, we have an abundance. Gas adds diversity, so underpins reliability. In terms of affordability, I'll introduce this a little bit more, but if you can think, if we can repurpose our gas infrastructure through renewable gas, it means we don't have to build that out in the form of electricity. So that has got to be worth looking at. So it's an important point. And the other thing I would say is just think about at the residential level of an individual customer, the upheaval that they're potentially going to see as we go through this transformation. How do we make it easier for the customers? How do we continue to provide choices? And finally, sustainability. As you think about getting rid of coal even more quickly in the system, I reflect on what's happened in the US over the last 10 years. They've retired some 80 gigawatts of coal-fired generation. They've replaced it with 2/3 renewables, 1/3 gas. The net effect of that is that they've reduced over that period their net emissions by about 500 million tonnes, which is the equivalent of what we would produce at an economy level in 1 year. So it's a significant contribution. So the easy pickings is really, gas for coal. This is an interesting study that we weren't unique because Europe has done this. I think the US has probably done this as well. But Energy Networks Australia worked with Frontier Economics, and we didn't look at all the elements, but we looked at the affordability elements of getting to net zero through two different pathways. One of them was full electrification. And what do we need to do to fully electrify the economy, and what's the cost associated with that? And we compared that to a hybrid, which is the one where we have gas infrastructure repurposed through biogas and hydrogen, natural gas with CCUS. And what does that look like? And the difference out through 2050 is something like 12 billion per annum in favour of pursuing a hybrid pathway. The hybrid pathway, however, assumes that you can get access to biogas, and at a certain point it assumes that hydrogen gets to the right price point, which is $1 to $2 a kilo, but that was back when gas was priced at about $8 to $10 a gigajoule. And Mike down the back tells me that net back prices in the Wallumbilla are much higher than that at the moment. So, what's happened is probably, if anything, started to push, that equation even more so in favour of potential hydrogen. So there's a huge cost difference between the two. Come back to looking at that net zero energy system and just look at what it might mean in terms of what people see in those different elements of electricity and then the end users. On the electricity side, as I think Rob has indicated, I think gas at the moment is uniquely placed to play that firming role for basically power generation. The way I think about it is predominantly in the past we had coal. And we had other forms, that was the dispatchable energy, that was the base load, and on top of that we had different forms of generation sitting on top of it. Now we're probably not going to consider renewable base load, but it will be the predominant form of electricity generation, and we need to supplement that, not only with batteries and pumped hydro that are probably good for the day's peak, but not for peaking days, not for days on end. You need some other form of technology, and that's either gas, it's either coal, it's either nuclear, and clearly we've made some choices already which have ruled out some of those. So gas becomes a critical player in that. On the customer side, we see that the customer can actually be provided with choices. We can try and minimise the interference to customers at a street level, at a household level, if we can actually develop a biogas industry that provides a bridge into hydrogen. Transport level, I think electric vehicles are probably going to be powered by lithium batteries. Heavy haul, long haul, where energy density becomes critical, is more likely to be something like hydrogen and fuel cells. And then when you go down to industry, there's a number of different ways that industry can be supplied with gas, not only biogas, hydrogen, but equally, where CO2 is already being stripped out of processes, carbon capture and storage is that much easier, but equally on generation, retrofitting it to be able to strip out CO2 is something that's certainly worth having a look at. So what we believe is required is that, we need, given that future and given the cost that we face into if we go for full electrification, and particularly all the effort that's been put into the development of biogas industry across the globe already. It's a $60 billion per annum industry. It's projected to be $120 billion per annum in US by 2030. So it's a thriving industry in countries like Germany, Italy and the US. And we have biogas potential in this country. So we need to think about how we can actually scale up that industry. The world is putting a lot of effort into solving the green hydrogen problem. And I wouldn't bet against human ingenuity. So somewhere, somehow, scale, innovation will come to bear. And I suspect we'll get the right price point for hydrogen in due course. So what we need to do as we look at some of our assets, particularly in New South Wales, is we need to actually scale up the biogas industry as a bridge towards hydrogen. Give you a flavour of some of the things that we are doing to actually give some tangibility to that. We are, and a pilot project, is really worth 1,000,000 words if a picture's worth 1,000 words. It actually demonstrates in a local jurisdiction what the technology is about. And it doesn't have to push the technology frontier. It just needs to be a demonstration project for the benefit of the local stakeholders and regulators so they can see what needs to be done to accommodate it in standards and potentially facilitate the startup of the industry. From a customer point of view, because there's a lot of noise, it's important that we can demonstrate that these projects are real and they can have a look at them and feel them and actually become comfortable with the fact that gas has got a role to play. And then equally from a company's point of view, very much like we did with the renewable energy industry, before that was actually economic, we were starting to subsidise and build a capability in the country. Now that it's the cheapest form of energy, we have a capability that we can rely on to actually deliver. And again, these pilot projects are really important. And I can say with Rob and others across the country, we are sharing through different platforms the experiences that we have. We're very cognizant that this is about building capability across the industry to actually demonstrate what is possible. Western Sydney Green Gas Project, it's sort of modest in scale, very modest in scale. It's a 500 kilowatt electrolyser, but what we've sought to do is actually try and demonstrate all the different uses that we can put hydrogen to. So we've got, basically we're blending hydrogen back into the network, small percentages, but that's important to demonstrate its viability in that use. We've also struck an arrangement with Corgas. They're taking gas through a refuelling station, and Hyundai are using that at Macquarie Park for a fleet of SUVs. We've also got a micro turbine on site to demonstrate that we can use power generation and source that with hydrogen as well. So it's a living laboratory. It's available to anybody to come in and have a look, because this is a demonstration of what the future might look like. On the biogas side, a lot of those stats are from a recent government paper which talked about the enormity of the industry. I think suffice to say that we've done a pretty comprehensive study in New South Wales, and we see biogas potential in New South Wales coming up to around 30 petajoules per annum. We distribute about close to 100 petajoules per annum in our gas distribution network in New South Wales, but interestingly, the residential base is around 30 to 40 petajoules per annum. So we almost have enough biogas to supply the residential customer base. So it's certainly something that we're turning our attention to. It's certainly something that we want to see the New South Wales government put regulatory and policy support behind. And we think the easiest way to do that is to set a renewable gas target for 10%, some number, by 2030. That provides the impetus for companies to come alongside ours and actually develop that suite of projects that are going to actually then give rise to the industry and make that significant contribution. The Malabar Project, this is well under construction and probably due to be commissioned soon. It's a partnership that we've got with Sydney Water and ARENA. It's the first biomethane gas project that we've got in the country. It's situated on Sydney Water's largest wastewater site. We're taking biogas that might otherwise be inefficiently vented, burnt, used in some way. We're actually cleaning it up. We're putting it into our gas distribution system that has the benefit, of course, of offsetting other natural gas. So as part of a circular economy, you get a net benefit in emissions reduction. And that's really what we want to see scaled up over the next 10 years. So my very simple message, I think, when I come down to it, is that there are many pathways to get to net zero by 2050. And if I think about the way that our company will start to look at the energy trilemma, it's about reliability, affordability, and doability. The 3 S's are a given: security and sustainability and safety. And which of the pathways, is it full electrification or is it a hybrid, that gives you the most confidence that you're going to be able to satisfy those 3 elements? And on reliability, I think diversity in fuel would suggest that that's a more reliable system than one that is heavily dependent on only one industry. Affordability, I think if we can repurpose our gas infrastructure and avoid building that out in electricity, that's got to be a huge benefit. And on the doability side, given, going back to Alan Finkel's words, the enormity of the challenge in front of us, I would say I'd prefer to have 2 industries with all the capability and capacity that we've built in those getting us to net zero by 2050 than to bet prematurely on one industry and be very disappointed when we get to 2050. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Frank. No one has actually put a question in, which tells you one of 2 things. You've blown them away and they can't actually think of anything to ask, or it's just, it's just very difficult. I would actually like to ask a question around what you've been talking about. Is presumably you've been talking to government about this, because it seems to me that the settings for all these things have to really be put in place by government.
Yeah.
So what sort of feedback are you getting from our current government, and perhaps, given that we have a federal election coming up and there may be a change of government, where do you think the opposition that could become the government might stand on these things?
Well, I think, within New South Wales, I think we're making some pretty good headway in terms of talking to Matt Keane and the government there about how we accommodate potentially biogas and the scaling up of biogas. I think federally, there's a lot less now that sort of separates the 2 political parties, but I think gas is something that's quite interesting. I think at the moment we know that the federal government does, it had a gas-fired recovery. It is quite supportive of the development of the Beetaloo and other things that Rob spoke about. The Labor Party has been, I think, more silent in terms of how it sees gas. I think Chris Bowen is somebody that's pretty systematic. I think he's pretty measured. So I have every hope that as, if there is a change in government, that we'd be able to work with him and demonstrate sort of the benefits that come from thinking about renewable gas and all the things that I've just spoken about.
We have another question. Your thoughts on the Victoria gas substitution roadmap?
I think Rob would have said it. Why would you cut off your options so early in the piece? So if the gas substitution roadmap is about cutting out gas and reducing gas consumption, by whatever number by 2030, I think the targets should be set about reducing emissions, they shouldn't be prescribing a pathway, because it's, you know, probably leading to unintended consequences. And that's one of the things that I've tried to highlight, both at a residential level for an individual customer, but equally in terms of the doability that we're going to sort of face into. And, you know, I do tend to think, you know, Rob's point about hydrogen, if we've managed globally to solve the hydrogen problem and we become a major exporter, it would seem somewhat ridiculous if we're exporting hydrogen to the likes of Korea and Taiwan, Japan, and we haven't kept alive the infrastructure to be able to take it domestically and take advantage of it.
Thank you very much, Rob. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for that. That was a very well thought out presentation.